There is a town in northern Manitoba, a place called Thompson, that most Americans have never heard of and have no particular reason to think about. It sits about 700 kilometers north of Winnipeg, accessible by a single rail line and a highway that becomes impassable for weeks at a time in deep winter. And for most of the 20th century, Thompson was a nickel town. The International Nickel Company built it essentially from scratch in the late 1950s. They dug the mines, they built the houses, they built the school, the hospital, the hockey rink. And for decades, the nickel that came out of the ground in Thompson flowed south, through processing plants, through smelters, into American factories that turned it into stainless steel and batteries and jet engine components, and eventually the phones in your pocket. I'm telling you about Thompson, Manitoba, because what happened there is a microcosm of something much bigger. Something that most people in Washington never bothered to study because they didn't think they had to. The assumption, the deep bone-level assumption baked into decades of American trade policy was that Canada would always be there. That the flow of Canadian resources into the American economy was like gravity, automatic, inevitable. Not a choice that anyone in Ottawa was making, just the natural order of things. That assumption got stress tested this week in a way that nobody in the Trump administration appears to have fully anticipated. And the person doing the stress testing was a man named Mark Carney. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Mark Carney is not a politician in the traditional sense, or at least he wasn't until recently. He spent years running the Bank of Canada. Then he ran the Bank of England through Brexit, which, if you want a masterclass in navigating economic chaos while projecting absolute calm, is about as good a training ground as the modern world offers. He is not someone who makes impulsive decisions. He is not someone who shoots from the hip. When Mark Carney does something dramatic, it is because he has done the math, run the scenarios, and concluded that the moment is right. And this week, he concluded the moment was right. Before I tell you exactly what he did and why the reaction in Washington was what it was, if you're not subscribed yet, now would be a good time, because what comes next changes everything. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me. What Carney announced, and the announcement itself was delivered in exactly the measured central banker tone you would expect, which somehow made it more unsettling, not less, was a suspension of a critical trade channel that American industries had come to rely on so thoroughly that they had essentially stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the floor beneath your feet, until it isn't there. And here's the thing. Here's the thing that nobody in the immediate coverage seemed to fully grapple with. This was not a broad-based embargo. This was not Canada slapping tariffs on consumer goods and waiting to see what happened. This was surgical. This was targeted at a specific pressure point in the American economic architecture. A junction where Canadian resources and American production capacity had become so intertwined that interrupting the flow would send shockwaves through sectors that had nothing obvious to do with Canada at all. Energy was part of it. Of course, energy was part of it. Cross-border energy flows between the United States and Canada represent one of the most deeply integrated bilateral relationships on the planet. Pipelines, grid connections, joint infrastructure projects that took decades to negotiate and build. When you start pulling on those threads, you don't just affect the energy sector, you affect every industry that depends on energy inputs, which is to say, every industry, full stop. But it was more than energy. Manufacturing supply chains that run through both countries, agricultural processing corridors, rare material flows that feed into semiconductor production, into battery technology, into the defense industrial base. Carney and this is what stunned observers who watched it unfold, had clearly mapped the interdependencies with the kind of precision that comes from years of thinking about exactly these questions at the highest levels of global finance. The reaction in Washington was immediate, and depending on your perspective, either entirely predictable or deeply revealing about the state of American trade strategy right now. Trump responded with characteristic force, words like unacceptable, hints at countermeasures, the kind of language designed to project strength and control the domestic narrative. But here is the part that nobody is talking about. The financial markets didn't wait for the rhetoric to resolve itself. They moved immediately. Futures plunged. Currency traders scrambled for position. The Canadian dollar swung wildly before stabilizing under what traders interpreted as intervention signals. European markets opened lower. Asian exchanges followed. Gold ticked up. The dollar wavered in the way it wavers when investors start pricing in something they hadn't priced in before, which is to say, genuine uncertainty about the stability of the North American trade relationship. Drop a comment below. What do you think Trump does next? We'll be right back. Now, I want to be precise about something here, because precision matters. The immediate financial disruption, the red numbers on the screens, the surge in trading volume, the hedge funds repositioning, that is in some ways the less important part of this story. Markets are volatile. Markets recover. What is harder to recover from, what takes years and sometimes decades to fully repair, is the conceptual damage. Here's what I mean. For the past several decades, the operating assumption inside most American corporate boardrooms, and frankly, inside most of the relevant agencies in Washington, was that the US-Canada trade relationship was essentially a fixed constant, something you could plan around, something that didn't require the kind of geopolitical risk hedging you applied to, say, relationships with China or with countries in the Middle East. Canada was different. Canada was safe. Canada was, in the bluntest possible terms, taken for granted. Mark Carney just demonstrated that it shouldn't be. And this is the part that will outlast whatever short-term resolution eventually emerges from the negotiations that are now, according to sources on both sides, happening in ways that are quiet and not for public consumption. Even if the trade channel gets restored, even if both sides find a face-saving formula that lets them claim some version of victory, even if 6 months from now, the specific mechanism that Carney suspended is back up and running, the memory of this week will not go away. Corporate supply chain managers will now model Canada as a variable, not a constant. Insurance and risk pricing for North American operations will reflect the new reality. Investors will demand a premium for exposure to sectors that depend on cross-border flows that, it turns out, can be interrupted by a deliberate decision in Ottawa. The word resilience, which had already been circulating in boardrooms since the pandemic exposed how fragile just-in-time global supply chains really were, is now going to be applied to the US-Canada relationship in ways it never was before. And this brings me back to Thompson, Manitoba, and to the broader point that I think this story is really about. The United States has, for a long time, operated from a position of such overwhelming economic dominance that it has not always had to think carefully about the vulnerabilities created by its own dependencies. The sheer size of the American economy, the depth of its capital markets, the centrality of the dollar, the reach of its corporations, has functioned as a kind of insulation, a buffer against the kind of pressure that smaller countries feel constantly. But interdependence doesn't work in only one direction. When you build deep, complex, multi-decade economic relationships with other countries, even close allies, even neighbors, even partners with whom you share the world's longest undefended border, you create leverage on both sides of the equation. The United States created leverage over Canada. And Canada, it turns out, created leverage over the United States. Leverage that nobody in Washington fully audited because they didn't think they had to. Mark Carney audited it. That is what his background in central banking and global finance gives you. The discipline to map the actual structure of a system rather than operating on the assumptions about the system that everyone around you shares and therefore never examines. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. This story is far from over. Now, the Trump administration's response, beyond the public statements, beyond the language about retaliatory measures, faces a genuinely difficult strategic problem. And I want to be clear about what that problem actually is, because it has been somewhat obscured by the political theater surrounding all of this. The problem is not simply that Canada did something that hurt American interests. Countries do things that hurt each other's interests all the time. That's part of what trade negotiations are. The problem is that the decision to respond aggressively risks doing substantially more damage to American interests than the original action did. The sectors most exposed to escalation, energy, manufacturing, agriculture, technology supply chains, are not abstract. They are real industries with real workers in real states that have real electoral significance. Retaliation that injures those sectors does not play well in the places where it lands. And Carney, who again is not a traditional politician, but is someone who has spent his career thinking about exactly these kinds of systemic consequences, appears to have calculated this with some care. He chose a pressure point that created maximum leverage while minimizing the collateral damage inside Canada. He chose a moment when the American economy was already navigating inflation pressures, interest rate uncertainty, and the particular volatility that surrounds major political transitions that amplified the impact of his move. The question that is now hanging over all of it, the question being asked in Ottawa and Washington and Brussels and Tokyo and every other capital where people watch the North American economic relationship as a bellwether for the broader global trading order, is whether what just happened is a negotiating tactic or a structural shift. And here is my honest answer based on everything I have read and reported on this. It is both. It is a negotiating tactic in the immediate term. There will be talks. There will be a resolution of some kind. The trade channel will in some form reopen. That is almost certainly true. But it is also a structural shift because you cannot undemonstrate something. You cannot unshow the world that a lever exists and that someone is willing to pull it. Once that knowledge is in the system, in the models, in the risk frameworks, in the assumptions of every corporate and governmental planner who watched this week unfold, it stays there. It changes the calculations permanently. The world that existed before Mark Carney made that announcement, the world in which the US-Canada economic relationship was treated as a fixed, inviolable constant that didn't need to be actively managed or protected or even particularly thought about, that world is gone. It didn't end with a bang. It ended with a measured statement delivered in the calm, precise language of a central banker who had done his homework. And when the history of this period is written, whenever that is, however this particular chapter ends, I think the thing that will most surprise future readers is not that the move was made. It's that the conditions for it were allowed to develop for so long without anyone in Washington asking the question that now, in retrospect, seems so obvious. The question of what happens when the country you've been taking for granted for 50 years decides it has other options. The nickel still comes out of the ground in Thompson, Manitoba. The question now is where it goes next.